A few years ago, my wife Clara and I moved to a small town with our son Ethan. We bought an old farmhouse just on the edge of town. It wasn't perfect, some creaky floors, a bit drafty, but it had character. The backyard opened to a vast field of wild grass and grain, stretching farther than the eye could see. For us, it felt like a fresh start. When we moved in, the first thing I noticed was a scarecrow in the field. It wasn't anything unusual, just an old burlap sack for a head, some straw sticking out of the plaid shirt it wore, and wooden beams for arms. Its face was nothing more than a vague smudge, probably from years of weathering. I figured the previous owners had left it behind. A week later, Ethan came running into the kitchen. "Dad, there's another scarecrow," he shouted, pulling me toward the window. I followed him outside, and sure enough, there was a second scarecrow standing about 20 feet away from the first one. It was smaller, wearing what looked like a child's overalls. I knew it hadn't been there when we moved in, but I shrugged it off. "Maybe a neighbor put it there," I said, though deep down, I wasn't convinced. Over the next few days, more scarecrows started appearing. By the end of the second week, there were 5 in total. Each one looked slightly different clothes, different sizes. Some were falling apart, their straw inside spilling out, while others looked new, almost freshly made. What unsettled me was how they seemed to be moving closer to the house. Every morning, they were a few feet nearer. Clara wasn't worried. "Maybe it's some kind of weird local tradition," she suggested when I brought it up. "Or kids playing pranks. Don't overthink it." But Ethan wasn't laughing. One night, just as we were tucking him into bed, he told me, "I saw them outside my window last night." I tried to reassure him. "They're just scarecrows, buddy. They can't move on their own." "I saw them, Dad," he insisted, his voice trembling. "They were standing by the tree." I glanced out his window. The scarecrows were still in the field, standing exactly where they'd been that afternoon. I told him it was just his imagination, but as I walked back to my own room, I felt uneasy. Things escalated about a week later. One evening, Clara and I were sitting on the couch when we heard it, a faint melody, like a slow, haunting lullaby, coming from the field. It was so quiet at first, we thought we were imagining it. But as we sat there, it grew louder, drifting through the open windows. "What is that?" Clara asked, her face pale. "I don't know," I admitted. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside. The air was cold and still, and the song seemed to be coming from the center of the field, near the scarecrows. "Be careful," Clara said, standing in the doorway as I walked toward the edge of the yard. I scanned the field with the flashlight. The scarecrows looked the same as always, standing motionless in the grass. But the song, if that's what it was, seemed to surround me, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. I took a few steps forward, but then the sound abruptly stopped, leaving nothing but silence. "See anything?" Clara called. "Nothing," I said, turning back toward the house. But as I started walking, Clara screamed, "Run! Get back here now!" Her voice was so panicked, I didn't even think. I just ran. I reached the yard and turned to look at her. "What's wrong?" "They were coming," she said, grabbing my arm. "There were people, 4, maybe 5 of them, running out from behind the scarecrows." My stomach dropped. I didn't see anything, but Clara was certain. We locked the doors and windows and went upstairs to call the police. Ethan was already asleep, and we didn't wake him. I didn't want to scare him unless I had to. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They searched the field and the property but didn't find anyone. The scarecrows were still there, exactly where they'd been earlier. The officers suggested it might have been trespassers or kids playing pranks, but they didn't have much else to offer. "Put up some cameras," one of them suggested. "It'll make you feel safer." Clara wanted to leave the next day. "This place doesn't feel right," she said. "What if those people come back? What if they try to get inside?" I understood where she was coming from, but I couldn't justify moving so soon. We'd spent most of our savings on the house, and starting over again wasn't an option. "Let's give it a little more time," I said. "We'll install cameras, get better locks. If anything else happens, we'll go." She reluctantly agreed, and I spent the weekend setting up motion lights and a few basic cameras around the house. For a while, things seemed to go back to normal. The scarecrows stayed in the field, and there were no more strange noises or uninvited visitors. But the unease never really went away. Some nights I'd wake up and look out the window, half expecting to see the scarecrows standing in the yard. Once or twice I thought I heard that same haunting melody in the distance, but it was so faint I convinced myself it was just the wind. It's been a few years now, and we're still living in the house. Nothing like that night has ever happened again, but the scarecrows are still there. They've weathered with time, their clothes faded and torn, but no one has ever come to move them. Clara still brings up the idea of leaving every now and then, but we've settled in, and Ethan seems happy here. I don't know who or what was out there that night, and I'm not sure I want to know. All I know is, I don't go into the field anymore. Whatever's out there can stay out there. Before we move on to the next story, if you're still here, make sure to subscribe and comment where you're tuning in from for more true stories. Thanks. I just bought my first house. I was in the house all weekend cleaning, scrubbing floors, raking leaves, and getting it move-in ready. I left Sunday night around 7 p.m. with the whole place in pristine condition. On Monday at 8 a.m., my movers arrived at my apartment to load up everything to move to the new house. I took some personal items and headed over for a drop-off by myself. I entered the house and rushed upstairs, taking toiletries to the bathroom. On my way down, I began realizing that I could smell an awful smell that was like a mix of urine and cigarettes. When I left the house on Sunday, the entire house smelled like Clorox. I knew something was wrong. I realized someone had been in the house the night before, after I left from a long day of cleaning. I thought to check upstairs while I was up there for trash or damages. So I took a moment to check all the upstairs rooms and closets. As I went back downstairs, I then realized my living room window had been pushed in from the top and was hanging off the windowsill. At that moment, I decided to go back outside and call the cops. I walked down the hall to the back door into the garage where I came in. I saw light coming from under the basement door under the stairs. I opened it and called down, "Is anyone down there?" Silence. I repeated it. No response. I looked down deeper at a different angle and saw a leg scurry out of my viewpoint. I slammed the door shut and barricaded it by using the adjacent back entrance door, opening it so it blocks the basement door from opening. Then I heard someone barreling up the stairs and aggressively trying to get through the door. We had a push and shove, and he was cursing and threatening me. I got my phone out to call the cops. I fought the door back and forth with him, going from threatening to begging to reasoning, etc. But I was terrified and wasn't listening to a word. All I cared about was making sure this person did not get through that door. The cops arrived and took over. I went out to my car while they did whatever they were doing with him. 20 minutes later or so, they came out, and I finally saw what the guy looked like. Someone who hasn't seen a sober day in 10 years, probably. He cussed at me as they walked him to the car. The next 2 hours were spent with the cops taking evidence all over the house. Cigarette butts, heroin in the basement, handprints on all the windows, assessing damages, etc., and asking questions. While all this was going on, I checked my mail, and there was a note on top of my mailbox addressed to someone named Sarah about how to get into the house. It threw us all off that we have the same name, and we all thought it was addressed to me at first. But then we realized it was a coincidence. The guy left the note to the girl, so they pre-planned breaking in, and he was here first. After 2 hours, the cops took all the evidence, and I was alone in the house again. My realtor asked me to take some pictures of the basement situation. Reluctantly, I went down there. As I was taking pictures, I saw something in the corner of my eye. It was a hand sliding into the shadows underneath the furnace. I ran up the stairs, barricaded the door, and called the police again. They came and arrested the second person who was hiding in my basement in a very small, seemingly impossible gap between the furnace and wall. This person turned out to be female. My mind never thought or cared about whether they were male or female, strong or weak, or someone I could overpower. I never saw them at all, other than quick glimpses of body parts and shadows, at least not until they were arrested. All I could think about is the fact that there are intruders in my home, and I didn't know who or why. So all I cared about was making sure they did not get through that door. The two people that invaded my house both have a criminal history. Both have been charged with burglary, criminal mischief, and bail and probation violations, as well as destruction of property. I now understand why they were there and likely could have been harmless, as many people love to tell me that they were just looking for an empty place to get high and do what they do. But that doesn't erase the fear and traumatic experience of realizing you are not alone in your home and having someone violently fight you through a door and threaten you that you cannot see. If there's one place you should always feel safe, it's in your home. After that incident, I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability. The thought of that basement, with its dark corners and hidden spaces, haunted me every time I entered the house. It wasn't just the break-in, it was the overwhelming sense that someone could be watching or lurking without me knowing. It became clear to me that I could never feel truly safe there again. So I made the difficult decision to leave. I shifted to a new house shortly after, leaving behind the memories of that basement and the fear that it had instilled in me. It was a fresh start, but I knew the experience would stay with me forever. So a couple of months ago, me and my family of 4 plus 2 dogs moved house from living in a village to living in a small old farmhouse. The new house is a 10-minute drive from the nearest town, so it's not too far, but it's one of 2 houses in the area. The other house's occupants were in the process of moving out, so they were rarely home. With hardly anything surrounding it apart from fields, one tucked-away house, and one road connecting us to the town. A few days after officially moving there and unpacking most of our stuff, my parents had to go out to work. Their jobs usually mean that, on weekdays, I have to wait until they finish work for them to pick me up and drive me home. On weekends, this means I stay home unbothered until around evening when my parents get home, or my brother wakes up. He usually sleeps for 16 hours at a time due to his crowded schedule or something. On this particular weekend, my parents decided that after work they were going to visit a friend's house on the other side of the area. My brother was home, but he was determined to stay asleep and told me not to bother him under any circumstance. So basically I had the house to myself for the whole day, with no jobs or work to do apart from walk the dogs and stuff. Anyway, so around 6 in the evening, it was already getting dark outside. I was watching YouTube in my room upstairs when I saw the headlights of a car slowly making their way down the very long road towards our house. My first thought was that something was wrong, but then I realized the car was probably for the one other house next to ours, whose occupants were just moving out, coming to collect their stuff or something. Due to me not thinking much of the car, I just continued watching YouTube. Not even 2 minutes later, I hear my youngest dog sounding off downstairs. I instantly get the worst vibe I have felt in a long time, so I decided the best course of action would be to go downstairs and investigate what was causing my dog to bark. Since no one had been downstairs since the morning, all of the lights were turned off and it was dark apart from a few lamps in the living room. When I got downstairs, I looked to see where the dog was barking, out the window. My dog had stopped barking as much since I was there now, but just to make sure everything was fine, I looked out the window to see what the cause of his distress was. When I opened the curtains enough so I could get a clear look out the window, I saw a car, still running, sitting in front of my garden. It took me a quick second in the dark to also notice that the front gate to my garden was open. My garden is surrounded by a low stone wall with a wooden fence on a latch. I then realized that a man I had never seen before was standing just beyond the open gate surveying the house, looking through the upstairs windows, presumably for human activity. I stared in bewilderment at this person for what felt like a really long moment before he turned and looked into the window I was staring out of. We locked eyes for about 3 seconds. He looked as shocked as I was. Moments later, he started running towards the car, and in my shock, I didn't know what to do but run upstairs and get my brother. By then, the dogs had made enough noise to wake my brother up, so I ran into his room and frantically yelled at him to come downstairs and look. By the time I managed to get him downstairs, the car had turned around and was just pulling away. The road outside my house leads to a dead end, and it's really hard to turn around as there isn't much space. It usually takes a min. We saw the car speed off down the driveway, and we just stood in shock for a while before any of us spoke. We decided I should call our parents and tell them to come home and explain what happened. After around another hour, both my parents were home, and neither of them believed me, brushing it off as probably just someone lost, and told me there was no need to call the police, so I felt really dumb for a while. Fast forward about 3 days. I was in school talking to my friends, and I found out that on the exact night this occurred, there had been a string of serial robberies around the area, mainly targeting isolated farmhouses. To make things worse, I learned that in one of the farmhouses, someone was seriously injured during the robbery. This news sent chills down my spine, and I couldn't help but think how close we might have been to becoming one of those victims. Since then, I've started locking the front door even in the daytime, and I feel a wave of panic every time my dogs start barking or I see a car approaching the house. It's been hard to shake the feeling that we narrowly avoided something terrible that night. If you have any scary stories, you can send them to the Gmail address shown on the screen.